The noise in the cafeteria was like a heavy blanket that you couldn't pull off your face. It was lunchtime at Lincoln High, which meant hundreds of students were talking, shouting, and laughing all at once. The metal tables rattled, and sneakers squeaked against the floor as people ran to get their favorite spots. For most of the kids here, this was the best part of the day. It was a break from classes, a time to check their phones, and a time to eat until they were completely full. But for one girl sitting near the back wall, lunchtime was the hardest part of the day. She sat alone. Her back was pressed against the cold concrete wall, and she was trying her best to make herself look small. She wore an oversized gray hoodie that had seen better days. The cuffs were a little frayed, and the color had faded from washing it so many times. She kept her head down, her long, dark hair falling around her face like a curtain. She hoped that if she didn't look at anyone, nobody would look at her. On the plastic tray in front of her, there wasn't much. There was no hot meal steaming with cheese or grease. There were no crunchy snacks or a carton of chocolate milk. Her tray held only 3 things: a small red apple that had a bruise on one side, a carton of plain milk, and a sad little packet of graham crackers that looked like it had been crushed at some point. This was all she had. It wasn't because she was on a diet. It wasn't because she was sick. It was simply because this was all she could afford. Her family was going through a very rough time. Money was so tight that sometimes there wasn't enough for groceries. Her mother worked 2 jobs, but even then, the bills kept piling up. This week, the pantry at home was almost empty. She had used the last of her change to buy the milk, and the rest was just what the school gave out for free to students who couldn't pay. Her stomach felt like it was folding in on itself. It made a low, growling sound, but she tried to ignore it. She took a sip of the milk, trying to fill the empty space, but it just wasn't enough. She watched enviously as a girl at the next table bit into a thick slice of pepperoni pizza. The cheese stretched out when she pulled the slice away, and the smell of the sauce and spices drifted over, making her mouth water. She quickly looked away, staring at the patterns on the table, trying to think about anything else besides food. She thought about her math class. She thought about the history chapter she had to read. She thought about the clouds outside, but her stomach kept bringing her back to reality. She was dizzy with hunger. It felt like a headache, right behind her eyes. She just wanted to eat her little apple and crackers in peace, and then go to the library to sleep until the bell rang. Unfortunately, peace was not something she was going to get today. A few tables away, a group of loud boys were throwing crumpled-up napkins at each other. They were the kind of students who always had the newest shoes and the biggest lunches. They never worried about money. One of them, a tall boy with a backward baseball cap and a loud voice, was leaning back in his chair, balancing on 2 legs. His tray was pile high with a burger, a pile of fries, 2 pieces of chicken, and a bottle of fruit juice. He had more food on his plate than the girl had seen in her kitchen for a week. The boy with the cap, whose name was Brad, was looking for a laugh. He always needed attention. He glanced around the room, his eyes scanning for someone to pick on. When his eyes landed on the girl in the corner with the empty tray, he stopped balancing his chair. The front legs of the chair hit the floor with a loud thud. "Yo, guys," Brad said, nudging the boys sitting next to him. "Look at that." The other boys turned their heads. They saw the girl sitting alone, picking up her small, bruised apple with 2 hands. "Is she doing a challenge or something?" Brad asked, his voice loud enough for the people around him to hear. Like, is she seeing how long she can go without eating real food? The boys chuckled. It wasn't a kind laugh. It was the laugh people do when they feel better about themselves by putting someone else down. "Nah, man," said another boy, wiping ketchup off his chin. "I think that's just her lunch." "That's it." Brad frowned, pretending to be shocked. That's it? That apple looks like it lost a fight." He raised his voice, directing his words toward the girls' table. "Hey, you need some help with that? That looks way too heavy for you." A few girls at a nearby table giggled. The sound of their laughter was like a knife to the girl. She didn't look up. She just wanted them to stop. She put the apple down on her tray, her appetite disappearing even though she was starving. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, trying to protect herself from the words. Brad wasn't done. He loved an audience, And now people were starting to look. He picked up a golden, warm dinner roll from his basket. It was soft and fluffy, the kind that smells like yeast and comfort. He held it up like a trophy. "Hey!" Brad called out again, louder this time. "I'm full. You want this? It's fresh." The girl froze. Her body betrayed her. Her head snapped up just for a second, looking at the bread. Her eyes widened. She was so hungry that the offer felt like a lifeline. She hadn't eaten bread in days. For a split second, hope flared in her chest. Seeing her look at the food, Brad grinned. It was a mean, sharp grin. He took the bread and acted like he was going to throw it to her. The room got a little quieter as people watched to see what would happen. The girl flinched, preparing to catch it, her hand coming out from under the table. But Brad didn't throw it. At the last second, he pulled his arm back and took a huge bite out of the roll, chewing with his mouth open. "Psych!" he yelled, spraying a few crumbs. "You should have seen your face. You look like a puppy dog." His table exploded into laughter. One of them slapped the table so hard the soda bottles shook. They thought it was the funniest thing in the world. The girl felt her face turn hot. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was a deep, burning shame. She felt small. She felt worthless. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. If she cried, they would win. She blinked rapidly, looking back down at her tray. She picked up the graham cracker packet. Her hands were shaking so much that the plastic wrapper crinkled loudly. Brad laughed again. "She's still eating the cardboard," he announced to the room. "Look, she's cracking up. Get it? Crackers." More laughter. It was spreading now. Other kids who didn't even know Brad were joining in, pointing and whispering. The girl felt like everyone in the cafeteria was staring at her. She felt like she was under a spotlight. The noise of the room seemed to get louder and louder, pounding in her ears. She could hear the thump-thump of her own heart. She tried to open the cracker packet, but her fingers were clumsy and weak. The package slipped from her grip and slid across the tray, falling onto the floor. The laughter died down for just a second, as everyone watched to see what she would do. She leaned down to pick it up. "Oh, she's going for it." Brad shouted, standing up now. $5 as she eats it off the floor." "No way, man," his friend said. "She's starving. She'd eat anything." The girl grabbed the packet off the dusty floor. She sat back up, holding the crushed crackers. She looked at Brad. For the first time, her eyes met his. They weren't angry eyes. They were just tired. They were the eyes of someone who was exhausted from trying to survive. She didn't say a word. She didn't yell back. She just looked at him. And then she looked at his tray full of food. That look made Brad uncomfortable for a second. He stopped smiling for a moment, but then he pushed the feeling away. He couldn't look weak in front of his friends. "Whatever," Brad said, sitting back down and grabbing a handful of fries. "Ignore her. Let's go." He turned his back on her, but the damage was done. The mood in the cafeteria had shifted. The air felt thick and mean. The girl sat there, holding her packet of dirty crackers. She looked at her milk, her apple, and the bread she would never get to taste. She was still so hungry, but now she just felt sick. She put her head down on her arms on the table, closing her eyes, wishing she could just disappear into the floor and be gone. The girl didn't move. She kept her head resting on her arms, hiding her face from the room. She listened to the sounds of chewing, slurping, and the clatter of metal forks scraping against plastic trays. It was torture. Every sound reminded her of the empty pit in her stomach. She wanted to run out of the room, but her legs felt too heavy to lift. Running took energy she didn't have. Besides, if she stood up now, everyone would look at her again. They would see her red, puffy eyes. They would see the embarrassment written all over her face. So she stayed frozen, like a statue in the middle of a noisy storm. Brad, however, was not done. For him, the situation was just getting started. He thrived on this kind of attention. He loved being the center of gravity, the guy who made everyone laugh, even if it was at someone else's expense. He leaned back in his chair again, balancing on the back two legs. He looked at his friend with a wide grin, looking for validation. "Did you see her face?" Brad asked, nudging the boy next to him with his elbow. She looked like she was going to cry over a piece of bread. It's just bread, man. It's not the end of the world. His friends laughed, but it was a softer laugh this time. Some of them were actually starting to feel a little weird about it. Picking on someone is fun when they fight back or when they act annoyed. But picking on someone who is just sitting there, taking it, and who was clearly going through a hard time, that felt different. It felt heavy. One of the boys, a quieter kid named Sam, just looked down at his own tray and shuffled his fries around. He didn't say anything, but he didn't laugh either. Brad noticed the silence. He didn't like it. He needed the energy to stay high. He felt like he was losing the room, and he couldn't let that happen. He looked back at the girl huddled in the corner. She was still hiding. "Don't go soft on me now, guys," Brad said, his voice getting louder to cover up the awkwardness. "We're just having fun. It's a joke, right?" He looked around for a new angle. He saw the basket of food on his tray. He had barely touched anything. He had taken one bite of the roll he had taunted her with, leaving it sitting there on the napkin, slightly squashed. He had a whole cheeseburger wrapped in paper. He had a pile of golden French fries that were slowly getting cold. An idea popped into his head. It was a bad idea, a mean idea, but in his mind, it was pure gold. It was exactly the kind of thing that would get the whole cafeteria talking again. "Hey," Brad said, his voice dropping to a loud whisper that everyone nearby could hear. "I bet she's still hungry." He picked up the half-eaten roll. It was soft white bread, the kind that sticks to the roof of your mouth. It was simple food, but to the girl in the corner, it would have been a feast. Brad held it up between his thumb and forefinger, inspecting it like it was a piece of gold. "I'm actually full," Brad announced at the table. "I don't want this. It's going to waste." He looked at the girl's back. She wasn't moving. "Hey, hungry girl," he shouted. The girl flinched. She didn't lift her head, but her shoulders stiffened. She was praying for him to stop. She was praying for the bell to ring. She was praying for anything to make this moment end. "I got a deal for you," Brad yelled, standing up this time. He walked a few steps closer to her table, but he stayed at a safe distance, like he was approaching a wild animal. "I bet you want this, don't you?" He waved the bread in the air. The smell of yeast drifted toward the girl. Her stomach growled again, loud and angry. She clenched her fists tighter. "Let's make a game out of it," Brad said, turning to the crowd that was gathering. He loved that people were watching. Students from other tables were turning their chairs around. Even the girls who had been giggling before were looking now, their smiles fading just a little into confused looks. "I'm going to roll this bread across the floor, like a bowling ball." He pointed to the girl. "If you can catch it before it stops, you can have it." And he paused for dramatic effect, pulling a crumpled $5 bill out of his pocket and holding it up. "I'll throw in $5. That's like a fortune for you, right?" The room gasped a little. This wasn't just teasing anymore. This was a spectacle. It was cruel. "Come on," Brad said, his voice taunting. "It's easy money. It's easy bread. Just get ready." The girl slowly lifted her head. Her eyes were rimmed with red, but they were dry now. She looked at the bread in his hand. She looked at the dirty floor. The cafeteria floor wasn't clean. It was covered in dust, old food crumbs, and sticky spots where soda had been spilled weeks ago. It was disgusting, but she was so hungry. The hunger was a pain that didn't go away. It clouded her judgment. She looked at the bread, and for a second, she forgot about her pride. She just saw food. "Brad, maybe don't do that," Sam said from the table. His voice was quiet, but in the sudden silence of the room, it sounded loud. "It's kind of gross, man." "Shut up, Sam," Brad snapped without looking back. "She wants it. Look at her." Brad crouched down. He held the bread in his hand, aiming for the gap between the tables. He looked like a golfer lining up a putt. He was grinning that same sharp grin, but his eyes were cold. He didn't care about the girl. He only cared about the laugh. "Here it comes." Brad shouted. "Go get it. Fetch." He swung his hand and released the bread. The roll hit the ground with a soft thud. It bounced once, then rolled across the dirty linoleum floor. It rolled over a sticker stuck to the ground and through a patch of dust. It was heading straight for the girls' table. Everything seemed to move in slow motion. The girl saw the bread coming. Her body reacted before her brain could tell her not to. She needed it. She was starving. She started to slide out of her chair, her hand reaching out, her fingers opening to grab the roll as it came near. It was a reflex. It was desperation. The room was dead silent. Everyone watched the bread roll. Everyone watched the girl reach for it. It was the most humiliating moment of her life. But the hunger was stronger than the shame. She was inches away. She was going to get it. She was going to eat it, dirt and all, because her body demanded it. Just as her fingers were about to brush the soft, white crust of the rolling bread, a heavy sneaker came out of nowhere. Smack! Brad stomped his foot down right on top of the bread. The girl's hand stopped in midair. She froze. Her fingers were hovering just inches above his shoe. The bread was squashed flat under his sneaker. The white yeast bun was now pressed into the dirty floor, ruined. The silence in the room was absolute. You could hear the hum of the large refrigerator in the kitchen. You could hear the ventilation fans whirring above. No one breathed. Brad looked down at her. He twisted his foot, grinding the bread into the floor, making sure it was completely destroyed. "Oops," Brad said, his voice loud and mocking. "My bad. I missed." He laughed. It was a short, barking laugh. "Too slow. You gotta be faster than that if you want to eat today." He looked up at his friends, expecting them to cheer. He looked at the other students, expecting them to laugh. But nobody laughed. The cruelty of what he had just done hung in the air like smoke. It wasn't funny anymore. It was just sad and mean. He had taken a starving person's hope and crushed it under his shoe, literally. Sam looked away, shaking his head. The girls who were watching looked at each other with wide eyes, their mouths open in shock. Even the teachers, who were usually busy chatting or looking at their phones in the corner, had stopped talking. One of them, Mr. Henderson, stood up from his chair near the door, frowning, tried to see what was happening across the crowded room. The girl slowly pulled her hand back. She stared at the flattened, dirty mess under Brad's shoe. The smell of the crushed bread mixed with the smell of old floor wax. It was over. The moment was over. She had lost. She wasn't going to eat. She looked up at Brad. Her eyes weren't full of tears anymore. They were empty. She looked at him with a gaze that was so hollow it made Brad's smile falter for a second. She didn't say anything. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just sat there, looking at him like he was nothing. Then she slowly stood up. She pushed her plastic tray away. She didn't want the apple, and she didn't want the milk anymore. She just wanted to be gone. She turned to walk away, her shoulders slumped, heading for the exit as fast as she could, without actually running. Brad stood there, one foot still on the bread. He looked around the room. The silence was heavy and suffocating. He realized that nobody was laughing with him. He felt a sudden flush of heat rise up his neck. He had wanted attention, but this felt wrong. This felt like he was a bad guy in a movie, and he didn't know how to fix it. "Whatever," Brad mumbled, kicking the ruined bread under the table. "She can't take a joke." He sat back down, but the energy was gone. His friends started looking at their phones, pretending they weren't there. The girl was almost at the door. The room felt cold. The crowd was shifting, uneasy, waiting for something else to happen to break the tension. The cruelty had peaked, and now they were all just waiting for the fallout. The girl walked with her head down, staring at the scuff marks on the linoleum floor. Each step felt heavier than the last, like her shoes were made of lead. Her stomach was still twisted in knots, aching and empty, but now a cold nausea had mixed with the hunger. She just wanted to escape. She wanted to push through the double glass doors at the end of the hall and disappear into the library or the bathroom, anywhere she could be alone. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her back, drilling into her hoodie. She felt like a target. As she passed the long rows of tables, the noise of the cafeteria started to creep back in, but it was different. Before it was loud and happy. Now it was a low, uncomfortable murmur. People were whispering. They weren't whispering about her anymore, though. They were whispering about what had happened. They were looking at Brad. The air in the room felt thick and sticky, like before a thunderstorm, even though the sky outside was bright blue. It was a heavy feeling you get when someone does something so mean that nobody knows how to react. She was just a few feet away from the exit. She reached out her hand to push the bar on the door, ready to leave the smell of food and the sound of laughter behind her. But then, a chair scraped loudly against the floor. It wasn't the screech of someone goofing around. It was a deliberate, heavy sound of metal dragging on concrete. The sound cut through the whispers like a knife. The girl stopped walking. She didn't turn around immediately. She just froze, her hand hovering over the door handle. She was terrified that Brad was coming back. She thought he was going to follow her, maybe say something worse, or trip her as she tried to leave. She squeezed her eyes shut for a second, waiting for the voice. But the voice didn't come. Instead, she heard footsteps. They were calm and steady, not the running footsteps of a jock or the shuffling footsteps of someone trying to sneak around. These were confident steps. Slowly, the girl turned around. Standing up from a table at the far end of the room was another student. It was a girl with messy, curly hair tied back in a loose bun. She was wearing a large paint-stained shirt and overalls. She wasn't part of the popular crowd, and she wasn't an outcast either. She mostly kept to herself, sitting with the art kids or sometimes alone, sketching in a notebook. Most people didn't really know her name. She was just a background character in the high school movie. But right now, she was taking center stage. The girl in the overalls didn't look at Brad. She didn't look at the teachers. She didn't look at the crowd of students who were all watching her with wide eyes. She only looked at the hungry girl, standing by the door. Her gaze wasn't full of pity. It was serious, calm, and focused. She reached down and picked up a brown paper lunch bag from her table. It was one of those classic bags, the kind that crinkles when you touch it. It was folded over at the top. Then she grabbed a bright neon orange can of soda and a carton of chocolate milk. The room went completely silent. You could hear the air conditioning humming in the vents. Everyone watched as the girl in the overalls walked around the tables. She moved with purpose, ignoring the open lane on the floor where Brad had crushed the bread. She stepped right over it. The hungry girl shrank back against the door as the stranger approached. She felt cornered. She didn't know what was happening. Was this another trick? Was this person going to make fun of her, too? The girl in overalls stopped right in front of her. She was close enough that the hungry girl could smell the faint scent of paint and turpentine on her clothes, mixed with the smell of the cafeteria pizza. For a second, they just looked at each other. The hungry girl's eyes were red and wary. The other girl's face was calm, her expression neutral but kind. Then, the girl in overalls held out the brown bag. "Hey," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. "I made way too much food today. My mom packs these massive lunches, and I can't eat it all." She thrust the bag forward gently, pushing it into the hungry girl's hands. "It's a turkey sandwich," she said, keeping her voice casual, like they were just chatting in a hallway, "on sourdough, with extra cheese. And there's some chips in there, too. I think there might be a cookie, but I'm not sure." The hungry girl stood there, stunned. Her hands automatically came up to hold the bag. It felt warm. It felt heavy. The weight of it in her hands was shocking. Through the thin paper, she could feel the shape of a thick sandwich. It was real food. It wasn't a bruised apple or crumbs. It was a real lunch. The girl in overalls wasn't done. She placed a cold can of soda and the chocolate milk on top of the bag in the hungry girl's arms. "And I hate soda," she said, shrugging her shoulders slightly. "I only drink water, but my mom keeps buying these. Do you want them? If you don't take them, I'm just going to throw them away, and that's a waste." It was a lie. The hungry girl knew it was a lie. The girl in overalls probably did like soda. It was obvious she was saying these things to make it easier, to make it so the hungry girl wouldn't feel like she was being given charity. She was trying to protect her dignity. She was turning a moment of shame into a simple transaction between friends. The hungry girl looked down at the food in her arms. Her eyes started to water again, blurring her vision. She tried to blink the tears away, but one escaped and rolled down her cheek. "Take it," the girl in overalls said softly. "Please, I really don't want it to go to waste." She reached out and gently touched the hungry girl's shoulder. It was a light touch, just a pat, but it felt incredibly grounding. It was the first kind touch she had felt all day. It broke the spell. Thank you, the hungry girl whispered. Her voice was cracked and dry. It was barely audible. The girl in overalls smiled. It wasn't a mocking grin or a sad smile. It was just a nice, genuine smile. No problem, she said. She didn't wait for a conversation. She didn't ask why she was hungry. She didn't ask about Brad. She didn't make a big scene about how generous she was being. She simply turned around and started walking back to her table. The change in the room was instant. As the girl in overalls walked away, the atmosphere shifted from heavy and cruel to something else. It was respectful. Students watched her pass by. Some of them moved their trays out of the way to give her room. A few kids nodded at her, acknowledging what she had done. Even the teachers, who were standing by the wall now, looked relieved. Brad was sitting at his table, his face turning a dark shade of red. He looked down at his tray, suddenly finding his cold fries very interesting. He didn't say anything. He didn't dare. The girl in overalls had made him look small without saying a single word to him. She had shown everyone what real strength looked like. It wasn't about being loud or knocking people down. It was about seeing someone who needed help and stepping up, even when it was awkward. The hungry girl stood by the door, clutching the brown bag to her chest. She could feel the warmth of the sandwich seeping through her hoodie. She could smell the faint scent of turkey and cheese. It smelled like safety. It smelled like home. For the first time all day, the gnawing pain in her stomach was replaced by a different feeling, a feeling of relief. She looked at the girl in overalls, who was now sitting back down and opening her sketchbook. The girl had already moved on, acting like it was no big deal. The hungry girl took a deep breath. She didn't feel invisible anymore. She felt seen. She felt like a human being again. She wasn't a punchline. She was just a student who was having a hard day, and someone had cared enough to help. She clutched the bag tighter. She wasn't going to run away to the library anymore. She was going to find a quiet corner, maybe outside under a tree, and she was going to eat the sandwich. And for the first time in a long time, she was going to be okay. The hungry girl stood by the glass doors for a long moment, clutching the brown paper bag against her chest like it was a shield. The warmth from the sandwich soaked through the thick material of her gray hoodie, seeping into her skin and making her realize just how cold she had been feeling. She could feel the slight weight of the soda resting on top of the bag, cool and condensation slick against her palm. It was real. It wasn't a trick. Slowly, she turned away from the exit. She didn't want to leave anymore. She didn't want to hide in a bathroom stall or sit on the cold floor of the library. The fear that had been driving her for the last hour had faded, replaced by a heavy, overwhelming sense of relief. She looked around the large room. Most of the tables were full, but there was a small, round table near the large windows that was empty. It was usually occupied by the chess club, but today they were absent. She walked toward it. Her steps were shaky at first, her legs feeling like jelly after the adrenaline spike. But they grew steadier with every step. As she moved through the rows of tables, the strangest thing happened. The whispering stopped. It wasn't the sudden silence of before, where everyone held their breath to see what Brad would do next. This was a respectful silence. Students watched her pass, but nobody pointed. Nobody laughed. A few kids even shuffled their backpacks off the empty chairs near the aisles, clearing a path for her as if she were royalty. She reached the round table by the window and sat down. The chair was hard plastic, but to her, it felt like a throne. She placed the brown bag gently in the center of the table. She didn't rip it open. She treated it with care, like it was something precious. Her hands were trembling slightly as she unfolded the top of the bag. The crinkling sound seemed loud in the quiet cafeteria. She reached inside and pulled out the sandwich. It was wrapped in white wax paper. As she peeled back the paper, the smell hit her instantly. It was the scent of roasted turkey, sharp cheddar cheese, and fresh sourdough bread. It was the smell of a homemade lunch, the kind of smell that usually made her feel sad and jealous. But today it just made her mouth water. She took a bite. The bread was soft and chewy with a slight crust. The cheese was creamy, and the turkey was smoky. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. Flavor exploded in her mouth, rich and savory. She closed her eyes for a second, chewing slowly, letting her body register that calories were finally coming. She swallowed, and she could feel the food travel down her throat, landing in her empty stomach and warming her from the inside out. The gnawing ache that had been her constant companion for days began to subside, replaced by a satisfied feeling. Across the room, the atmosphere had changed completely. Brad was still sitting at his table, but the dynamic had shifted. He wasn't holding court anymore. His friends, the ones who had laughed along with him 5 minutes ago, were now looking anywhere but at him. One of them was scrolling intensely on his phone, though the screen was clearly off. Another was picking at his fingernails. They looked uncomfortable. They looked embarrassed to be seen with him. Brad stared down at his own tray. He still had a pile of cold fries and half a burger sitting in front of him. Suddenly, the food looked disgusting to him. The grease was congealing and the bun was soggy. He pushed the tray away, his appetite gone. He looked over his shoulder, glancing toward the window. He saw the girl eating. She was taking small, deliberate bites. She wasn't shoveling it in, despite how hungry she must have been. She was savoring it. She looked peaceful. Brad felt a strange twisting sensation in his own gut. It wasn't hunger. It was something worse. It was a sick, heavy feeling of shame. He watched the girl in the overalls, who was now sketching in her book at her own table, completely unbothered. Then he looked back at the girl eating the sandwich. He saw her wipe a crumb from her lip with the back of her hand. She looked happy. What had he been thinking? Brad asked himself. Why did he do that? He tried to tell himself it was just a joke. It was just messing around. But looking at the crushed bread on the floor under his table, and then looking at the girl enjoying the meal she was given, the lie fell apart. It wasn't a joke. It was just mean. He had tried to break her, and instead, someone else had fixed her. He looked small. He looked weak. The contrast was painful. The girl in the overalls had spent nothing but a few minutes and a sandwich, and she had changed the whole mood of the room. She was a hero. Brad had spent his whole morning trying to be the big man, and now he felt like the villain. He slumped down in his chair, pulling the hood of his jacket up over his head. He just wanted the period to be over. He didn't want to look at anyone. He didn't want anyone to look at him. Meanwhile, the girl by the window finished half the sandwich and opened the carton of chocolate milk. It was cold and sweet, coating her throat and washing away the salty taste of the tears she had been holding back. She took a long drink, feeling the sugar rush to her brain, clearing away the fog of hunger. She looked around the room again. The sun was streaming through the windows, lighting up dust motes dancing in the air. The cafeteria was no longer a scary place. It was just a room full of people. Some were mean, some were kind, and most were just watching. She caught the eye of a boy sitting at the table next to hers. He was a freshman she had never spoken to. He quickly looked down at his pizza, but then he looked back up. He didn't smile, but he gave her a small, awkward nod. It was a sign of respect. He was acknowledging that she had survived something tough. She nodded back. It was a tiny movement, but it felt huge. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't the hungry girl who was a target for bullies. She was a person who had friends, or at least one friend who had her back. She reached into the bag and pulled out the bag of chips. It was a crinkly silver bag. When she opened it, the pop sound made a few people turn their heads, but they just smiled and turned back to their own food. She ate one chip, then another. The saltiness was perfect after the sweet milk. For the first time in a long time, her mind was quiet. The constant worry about money, about her mom, about her next meal, faded into the background for a few precious minutes. She just sat there, chewing, looking out the window at the trees swaying in the breeze. She felt strong. She felt like she could get through the rest of the day. She could go to math class and focus. She could go home and help her mom, because right now in this moment, her belly was full, and that made all the difference in the world. The silence in the room wasn't awkward anymore. It was a peaceful silence. It was a silence of people realizing that they had witnessed a moment of grace in the middle of a normal, ordinary Tuesday. And everyone, even Brad, knew that things were going to be different from now on. The lunch period wasn't over yet, but the chaotic energy of the cafeteria had completely changed. It was no longer a place of noise and aggression. It had settled into a heavy, thoughtful quiet. The girl by the window took the last bite of her sandwich, savoring the flavor of the cheese and the softness of the bread. She chased it down with the last sip of the chocolate milk, the cold sweetness settling in her stomach like a warm stone. She felt full. For the first time in weeks, the constant, gnawing ache in her belly was gone. It was replaced by a calm, steady energy that made her feel like she could finally think straight. She crumpled up the empty wax paper and stuffed it back into the brown bag, along with the empty chip bag and the milk carton. She took the orange in the bag and held it in her hand for a moment. It was bright and smooth, a perfect contrast to the bruised apple she had left on her tray earlier. She didn't peel it yet. She just held it, grounding herself in the reality of the moment. Her eyes drifted across the room. She looked toward the back tables where the drama had started. Brad and his friends were gone. Their trays were left sitting on the table, half-eaten food congealing in the open air. They hadn't bothered to clear their spots. They had just grabbed their backpacks and left, slipping out the side door while no one was looking. It was a cowardly exit. They couldn't handle the atmosphere they had created. They couldn't sit in the silence that judged them louder than any shout could have. Seeing their empty seats felt like a victory to her, but it wasn't a happy victory. It was just a fact. The bullies had left because they had lost the power they thought they had. Without the laughter of the crowd to feed them, they were nothing. She looked over to the far side of the room where the girl in the overalls was sitting. The artistic girl was packing up her bag, getting ready to head to her next class. She didn't look over. She didn't try to catch the hungry girl's eye to see if she was grateful. She just shouldered her backpack and walked out with her head high, moving to the rhythm of her own drum. That simple act, helping someone and then walking away without waiting for a thank you, was powerful. It showed that she did it because it was right, not because she wanted praise. The bell signaling the end of lunch finally rang. It was a harsh, electric buzz that broke the quiet spell instantly. Chairs scraped against the floor as hundreds of students stood up at once. The noise returned, but it was different now. It was a noise of business, of students moving to their next classes, talking about homework or weekend plans. The meanness was gone. The girl stood up from her table by the window. She felt lighter, almost like she was floating. She picked up the brown bag with the orange inside and walked toward the trash cans. As she moved through the crowd, something incredible happened. The sea of students parted for her. It wasn't done with fear or mockery like before. It was done with respect. A tall boy who was on the basketball team saw her coming. He was laughing with his friends a second ago, but when he saw her, he stopped laughing. He actually stepped back, pulling his friends with him, to clear a wide path for her to throw away her trash. He didn't say anything, but he gave her a small nod. It was a silent apology, acknowledging that what happened to her wasn't right. She nodded back, just a slight tilt of her head. She tossed the bag into the trash can. It landed with a soft thud. She kept the orange, putting it into the pocket of her hoodie. As she walked toward the exit doors, she passed the table where Brad had been sitting. The crushed bread was still on the floor, flattened into the dirt. She looked at it for a second. It used to be something she wanted desperately. Now it just looked like trash. She stepped over it without hesitation. She didn't look down at her feet. She looked straight ahead. She pushed through the glass doors and stepped into the hallway. The air here was cooler, smelling of floor wax and old textbooks. Usually, the hallway between classes was a stressful place for her. She would walk with her head down, try to avoid eye contact, worried that someone would bump into her or make a comment about her clothes. But today, she walked with her back straight. She pulled her shoulders back. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. The hunger that had made her weak and trembling was replaced by the calories from the sandwich. But it was more than that. She had a new kind of strength. She knew now that she could survive the worst day of school and come out the other side. She knew that even in a room full of people who laughed at her, there was one person who would stand up for her, and that one person was enough to balance out the crowd. She walked to her locker. She spun the combination dial, left, right, left, and opened the small metal door. She took out her history textbook. As she closed the locker, she caught a reflection in the small mirror stuck to the inside door. She looked at herself. Her hair was a little messy, and her eyes were still a little bit red from the tears She had fought back earlier, but she didn't look scared anymore. She looked determined. She looked tough. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the orange the girl in overalls had given her. She held it up like a small, round trophy. It was a symbol. It was a reminder that kindness existed, even when things seemed dark. She smiled at her reflection. It was a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes. A group of girls walked past her locker, chatting loudly. One of them bumped into her shoulder by accident. In the past, she would have flinched and apologized, even though it wasn't her fault. Today, she just stood her ground. The girl stopped and turned around. "Oh, sorry," the girl said, looking surprised. "I didn't see you." "It's okay," the hungry girl said clearly. Her voice didn't waver. The other girl smiled politely and kept walking. No scene, no drama, just a normal interaction between two students. The hungry girl closed her locker and turned toward her classroom. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with air. She wasn't a hungry girl anymore. She was just a student. She was a person who mattered. The hallway was crowded and noisy, but she felt a sense of peace walking through it. She knew the hunger would come back eventually. She knew life at home was still hard, but for today, for this moment, she was full. She was seen, and she was going to be okay. She walked into her classroom, found her seat, and pulled out her notebook, ready to learn. The nightmare in the cafeteria was over, and she had walked out of it standing tall.